Something was already moving through the data before anyone understood what they were looking at. The AI had been running for weeks. 9,000 recordings, tens of thousands of clicks, layered, compressed, organized by an architecture that researchers assumed they already understood. Sperm whales communicate through patterns called codas. Scientists had been studying them for decades. The accepted count was 21. 21 distinct patterns, probably fixed, probably simple, probably somewhere between a signal and a reflex. That was the textbook. That was the consensus. That was the number every paper referenced, every researcher repeated, every documentary echoed across 30 years of marine biology. Then the AI finished processing. The output didn't show 21 codas. It showed 156. And that was just the beginning of what no one had prepared for. There is a moment in every real discovery when the evidence stops matching the story that was built to contain it. This was that moment. Not a gradual revision, not a minor correction at the edges. The AI had found something hiding inside decades of recorded data that human researchers had held in their hands, listened to, published about, and fundamentally misread. The question that followed that output was not just scientific, it was something closer to philosophical vertigo. If the number was wrong, if the structure was wrong, then what exactly had been living in the deep ocean all this time, transmitting something that no one had been equipped to hear? That question is still open, and the deeper you go into what the AI actually found, the harder it becomes to close. Start with a sound. A single sperm whale click reaches 230 decibels underwater. That is louder than a jet engine standing next to it. It is, by some measures, the loudest sound produced by any living creature on the planet. For a long time, that fact was mostly treated as a curiosity of biology, a byproduct of the whale's unique anatomy, the enormous spermaceti organ that fills the front third of its skull. Oil-packed and precisely shaped to focus acoustic energy outward with extraordinary force. Researchers knew the clicks were organized. They knew whales exchanged them socially. They cataloged the codas, mapped the patterns, and built a picture of whale communication that looked, in hindsight, like a rough sketch passed off as a finished portrait. The sketch said, fixed signals, limited repertoire, probably used for identity and coordination. The kind of system you might expect from an intelligent but fundamentally simple communicator, sophisticated enough to be interesting, simple enough to remain manageable. The kind of system that did not threaten anyone's assumptions about what language was, where it came from, and which species were capable of producing it. Then, David Gruber sat down with a set of old recordings. Gruber was a marine biologist connected to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. He had spent years studying bioluminescence, cryptic animal signals, the hidden channels through which sea creatures exchange information. When he reviewed sperm whale click recordings, something bothered him. The patterns were not as simple as the literature described. There was layering inside the clicks, variations that the existing framework had not accounted for, not because the framework was lazy, but because the tools used to build it were not designed to detect what was actually there. The clicks had been analyzed the way you might analyze a foreign language, by counting how many times certain sounds repeated, without ever asking whether those sounds had internal structure. Combinable parts, modifiable components that changed meaning depending on context and sequence. He mentioned the recordings to Shafi Goldwasser, a cryptographer at MIT, someone whose professional instinct was built around the detection of hidden order inside apparent noise. Goldwasser listened and said something that changed the direction of the project entirely. That sounds like Morse code. Have you tried using machine learning to decode it? That suggestion opened a door that, once open, could not be closed again. The AI system they eventually deployed was structurally similar to the large language models behind tools like ChatGPT. It was trained not just on audio, but on audio with full behavioral context. Because the team had done something unusual before the AI ever ran a single analysis. For years, researchers working under the Project CETI initiative had been deploying hydrophone arrays and biologger tags in the waters off Dominica, in the Caribbean, where multi-generational sperm whale families returned year after year with reliable consistency. The tags were small, attached gently to whales, carrying 3 microphones, GPS sensors, depth gauges, and accelerometers. Every click recorded was tied not just to a sound, but to a moment. Which whale produced it? What depth they were at? Who else was nearby? What the social configuration looked like? Whether the group was calm or alert, feeding or moving, resting or interacting with a calf. That context was the difference between reading letters and reading sentences. When the AI processed 9,000 recordings with that level of contextual resolution, it did not just count patterns. It analyzed the internal structure of each pattern, and what it found inside the codas was something researchers had never described, had not thought to look for, and were not fully prepared to understand when it appeared. Each coda, the AI revealed, contained 4 distinct internal components: tempo, rhythm, ornamentation, rubato. These were not decorative variations around a fixed core. They were functional dimensions of the click pattern, each one independently adjustable, each one carrying information. The AI identified that these components could be combined in ways that produced meaning beyond what any single component contained alone. It was not a fixed signal system. It was a combinatorial one. The same underlying components could be arranged in different configurations to produce structurally different outputs with structurally different functions, much the way human phonemes combine to produce words, and words combine to produce sentences that mean things no individual sound could mean on its own. This is what linguists call duality of patterning. It is one of the defining structural features of human language. It had never been identified in any non-human species communication system before this analysis. Not confirmed. Not with this level of evidence. 156 codas. 4 modifiable internal dimensions. A combinatorial grammar operating across a social group that spent decades together, passed patterns down through generations, and modified those patterns in response to specific listeners and specific situations. Gaspar Bacchus, a linguist at UC Berkeley working with the acoustic data, slowed the recordings down and found something else entirely unexpected. The click patterns, when stretched and analyzed at lower resolution, contained structures that were acoustically analogous to vowels. Not identical. Not produced by the same anatomy. Sperm whales have no larynx, no vocal folds, no resonant oral cavity in the way humans do. The spermaceti organ produces sound through a completely different biological mechanism, and yet the acoustic output, when analyzed at the right scale, showed vowel-like structures. Modulated tonal qualities that rose, fell, and transitioned in patterns recognizable as phonetically functional. Dr. Daniela Roos at MIT, after reviewing the full analysis, did not reach for careful hedging language. She said, "Our results show there is much more complexity here than previously believed." That is the kind of statement that, in academic circles, carries the weight of everything that is not being said. Here is the thing worth holding on to as the evidence continues to build. This was not a new species discovered in an unexplored ecosystem. Sperm whales have been studied for generations. They have been hunted by humans for centuries. The Essex, a Nantucket whaling ship, was rammed and sunk by a sperm whale on November 20th, 1820. An event so remarkable it became the historical core of Moby Dick. Whalers kept logs. Marine biologists kept recordings. Oceanographers tracked migration, feeding, social behavior, acoustics. This was one of the most observed, most documented, most intensely studied creatures in the ocean. And inside all of that observation, a language had been hiding. Not a primitive signaling system. Not a behavioral reflex dressed up in pattern. A language. With structure. With grammar. With vowel-like acoustic components. with audience-specific adjustment, meaning whales changed how they communicated depending on who was listening. With cultural transmission across generations, meaning calves spent the first year or more of their lives learning vocal patterns from adults, not born with them, learning them, the way a human child learns to speak. With a brain, by the way, that weighed 6 times what a human brain weighs. The full implications of that had not yet settled over the research community when something else happened. Something that moved the story from analysis to interaction. In August of 2023, off the coast of Alaska, a research team led by Dr. Brenda McCowan at UC Davis made contact with a humpback whale they had been tracking and had named Twain. What happened in that 20-minute window has since become one of the most carefully cited events in the emerging field of interspecies communication research. The team had been studying humpback whale vocalizations with similar AI-assisted methodology. They transmitted a recorded humpback contact call. Twain responded, not once, repeatedly, with variations that matched the structural logic of the original signal. The exchange lasted 20 minutes. It followed communicative turn taking patterns consistent with intentional dialogue. McCowan said afterward, "We believe this is the first communicative exchange between humans and humpback whales in the humpback language." Think carefully about the weight of that sentence. Not the first time humans played a sound to a whale. Not the first time a whale vocalized near a research vessel. The first communicative exchange. Structured. Responsive. Intentional. Language meeting language across a gap that most of the scientific community had spent decades insisting could not be crossed. If you are the kind of person who finds this evidence worth sitting with, stay close to this story. The next layer of what the AI found is where the structure stops being just complex and starts being something harder to categorize. The Galapagos Islands. A separate research team tracking 25 sperm whales with acoustic monitoring equipment observed something that had not been recorded before. When the hydrophones were active, the whales went quiet. Not the random silence of animals resting or feeding. A coordinated, group-level silence that appeared to be a direct response to the presence of recording equipment. The whales, apparently, could detect the hydrophones, and when they detected them, the social group fell silent together. The question that raises is not a small one. If sperm whales can detect monitoring technology and collectively modify their behavior in response to it, what does that imply about the level of shared situational awareness operating inside a sperm whale social group? What does it imply about theory of mind, the cognitive ability to understand that another individual, human or otherwise, is observing you? What does it imply about the information being passed between whales in those silent moments that researchers' equipment was never in a position to capture? Because here is what the AI analysis had already established before the Galapagos observation was factored in. Whale communication was not just socially complex, it was audience-designed. The same whale in the same social group used different coda structures depending on which other whales were present. The pattern shifted based on who was listening. That is not reflexive communication. That is intentional communication. Communication shaped by awareness of the listener's identity, probably their relationship, possibly their state. The kind of communication that requires the communicator to model the mind of the receiver. Humans do this constantly. You speak differently to a child than to a colleague. You modulate, simplify, elaborate, adjust register and tone and vocabulary based on continuous real-time modeling of the other person's comprehension and expectation. The sperm whale data was showing the same structural behavior, expressed through click patterns rather than words, but functionally identical in its cognitive demand. And the brains were there to support it. 6 times the weight of a human brain. Long-lived, with individuals reaching 70 years of age. Multi-generational family structures in which grandmothers and mothers and calves traveled together across decades of ocean. Cultures in the genuine anthropological sense of the word, because sperm whale clans in different ocean regions produce different coda repertoires that cannot be explained by genetics. They are learned, they are transmitted, they are maintained across time and geography the way human dialects are maintained, not by instinct but by choice, by teaching, by cultural identity. The first decoded message in all of this was not complex. The researchers, still in the early stages of building a translation framework, identified a coda pattern, a specific 113 click sequence, and after mapping it against hundreds of instances of social context, produced an interpretation. The message, as best as the AI could determine, read as a statement of presence. 2 words in translation, anchored in the simplest possible social function. I am here. Think about why a creature says that, why it needs to say that. The ocean is dark. The distances between members of a sperm whale family can stretch across miles of open water. A 70-year-old whale moving through an ocean that has been measurably altered by industrial noise, sonar, the acoustic pollution of shipping lanes, and military equipment, transmitting a signal that says I am here, is doing something deeply recognizable, something that transcends the difference between species. It is locating itself within a relationship, announcing presence not just to space, but to another mind that matters. If you have been watching this channel and following the science that keeps widening what we thought we knew about animal cognition, now is the moment to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe if you haven't. Turn on notifications, because the translation work is continuing, and the next layers of this decoded language are already in analysis. The research community is moving faster than most people realize, and when the next threshold is crossed, you'll want to have been following the progression from the beginning. Because here is where the strangeness deepens in a direction the original research team may not have fully anticipated. The orca behavior that began appearing in 2020 off the Iberian Peninsula added a dimension to this conversation that no one had planned to include. Starting in that year, orcas began targeting sailing vessels, not randomly, not sporadically, with coordinated, repeated, regionally concentrated behavior that escalated consistently over 4 years. By 2024, over 500 incidents had been recorded. 3 vessels had been capsized and sunk. The behavior spread to new individuals across the orca social group. Young orcas who had never previously participated began joining interactions, learning the pattern from older animals. This was not instinct. Instinct does not spread horizontally through a population over 4 years in response to a specific type of object that has only existed for a fraction of the species' evolutionary history. Instinct does not escalate in complexity as it transmits. What spread through that orca population was learned behavior, passed socially, refined through transmission, probably reinforced through communication. The language infrastructure that Project CETI was mapping in sperm whales appeared to have a direct behavioral analog in orca populations. Not the same species, not the same communication system, but the same fundamental architecture, a socially transmitted behavioral complex encoded in and transmitted through a vocal communication system complex enough to carry specific technical knowledge across individuals and generations. That is the architecture of culture. That is the architecture of language used not just for social bonding, but for operational coordination, strategic knowledge transfer, and collective problem solving. Michael Bronstein, the AI researcher who helped connect large language model technology to the Project CETI analysis, described what the AI was able to extract from the click data as structurally equivalent to what LLMs extract from human text: modular components, combinatorial grammar, contextual embedding, pattern hierarchy. The model did not know it was analyzing a non-human communication system. The structural features it identified were the same features it would identify in any sufficiently complex language. That is not a metaphor. That is not anthropomorphism dressed in statistical language. That is a formal algorithmic assessment. The AI looked at the output of a sperm whale's spermaceti organ and identified the same organizational principles it found in human speech. Not because researchers told it to find them, because they were there. There is one more piece of the evidence architecture that belongs here, and it changes the emotional register of everything else. Robin Baird's research on what marine biologists call epimeletic behavior caregiving behavior in whales documents something that language alone cannot fully frame. Whales grieve, not metaphorically, behaviorally, acoustically, with measurable duration and social structure. Mothers carry dead calves at the surface for days. Social groups slow their movement, cluster, produce vocalizations distinct from their normal repertoire. The communication system that AI has now begun to decode was not built purely for navigation or feeding or threat coordination. It carries, verifiably, emotional content, social content, content that indexes loss, presence, relationship, and recognition. The first decoded message was, "I am here." In the context of what epimuletic behavior tells us about whale social and emotional architecture, those two words carry an extraordinary amount of weight. They are not just locational, they are relational. They are the thing you say to someone who might not know you are still there. They are the thing said across dark water to a mind that is listening for exactly that. The translation work is incomplete. Researchers are careful to say that. Full sentences remain untranslatable. The combinatorial grammar the AI identified is mapped but not fully decoded. The audience design data shows intentionality but cannot yet reliably predict what specific coda configurations mean in specific social contexts. There is a significant distance still to cross between identifying the existence of a complex communication system and being able to read it with confidence. But the distance that has already been crossed is not small. What began as 21 fixed patterns believed to carry simple identity signals has become 156 modular codas with internal four-dimensional structure, combinatorial grammar, vowel-like acoustics, audience-specific deployment, cultural transmission across generations, and at least one decoded unit of meaning that says, across 60 million years of separate evolutionary history, the most human thing imaginable. The AI did not crack whale language. Not fully. Not yet. What it cracked was the assumption that had prevented anyone from looking at it clearly. It proved that the structure was there. It proved the complexity was real. It proved that the right tools, applied to data that had been sitting in archives for decades, could find signal inside what everyone had filed away as noise. And once the structure is visible, once the grammar is mapped and the vowel inventory is charted and the audience design patterns are documented and the first translation, however partial, however provisional, has been produced, the question is no longer whether this is a language. The question becomes what it has been saying for 60 million years, in the dark. That question does not arrive quietly. It arrives with the full weight of everything the evidence has assembled, piece by piece, layer by layer, until the original assumption, the comfortable one, the one that said whales communicate but do not really speak, no longer has anywhere to stand. Consider what 60 million years actually means in this context. The lineage of sperm whales extends back to a point before humans existed as a genus, before the cognitive architecture that produced human language had taken its first tentative evolutionary steps. The structures that Project CETI's AI identified inside sperm whale codas did not emerge recently. They were not a response to human presence in the ocean, not an adaptation to industrial noise, not a behavioral novelty produced by the last few centuries of ecological pressure. They were ancient, shaped by tens of millions of years of social living, deep water navigation, coordinated hunting of prey that required group strategy to catch, and the transmission of knowledge across generations, without writing, without tools, without any medium other than sound moving through water. Human language, by the most generous archaeological estimates, is somewhere between 300,000 and 2 million years old. Sperm whale communication, in some form, predates that by an order of magnitude so large it stops being a comparison and becomes something closer to a reframing of the entire question. Which species, exactly, invented complex communication? The evidence is now suggesting the answer is not as simple as the textbooks ever made it sound. Shane Giro, the marine biologist who spent years in the waters off Dominica watching the same sperm whale families return season after season, described what the long-term observation revealed in terms that are worth sitting with carefully. These were not anonymous animals moving through interchangeable ocean. They were individuals, named individuals in the research framework, because naming was the only way to track the relationships that structured everything else. Mothers and daughters who had traveled together for decades, calves who were observed learning vocal patterns in the first year of life, not born with them, working toward them through practice and social immersion, failing at first, refining over time, eventually producing the coda repertoire of their specific family unit with the kind of precision that only comes from sustained intentional learning. What Jiro was watching, without yet having the AI framework to describe it formally, was language acquisition. Not instinct activation. Acquisition. The same fundamental process that a human child undergoes in the first years of life, absorbing the phonological system, the grammatical structure, the social conventions of a specific language community, and producing outputs that gradually approach native fluency. The sperm whale calves were doing the same thing, in a different medium, with different anatomy, in a social context defined by ocean depth and geographic migration rather than household and neighborhood. But structurally, functionally, developmentally, the same. The detail that sharpens this observation considerably is the cultural divergence between sperm whale clans. Researchers have documented that whale clans in the Pacific produce different coda repertoires than clans in the Caribbean, different again from clans in the Atlantic. These differences cannot be explained by genetics. The animals are not genetically isolated in ways that would produce divergent instinctive patterns. The differences are cultural. Regional dialects, in the precise linguistic sense of the term, maintained across generations not because the whales are born with them, but because the whales teach them, learn them, and use them as markers of group identity. If you encountered a community of humans in two separate geographic regions whose members shared DNA but spoke mutually distinct languages, you would call that culture. You would call it language. You would not call it a signaling system or a behavioral reflex or a communication-like behavior. You would call it what it is. The evidence from sperm whale clans is structurally identical. Different words, different grammar, different identity. Passed down. Maintained. Chosen in whatever way a sperm whale experiences choice. Here is where the AI's contribution moves past technical analysis into something that genuinely reshapes the stakes of the question. The deep learning model deployed by Project CETI did not evaluate the sperm whale click data against a predetermined template of what language should look like. It evaluated the data for internal organizational structure without prior expectation. What it found, the combinatorial architecture, the four modifiable dimensions within each coda, the duality of patterning, the audience-specific adjustment, was not found because researchers were hoping to find it. It was found because it was there, consistently, across 9,000 recordings, across multiple social groups, across years of documented interaction. Michael Bronstein, the AI researcher who connected large language model methodology to the acoustic analysis, made a point that deserves more attention than it has received in popular coverage of the project. The same class of AI system that learns to process human language by identifying modular units, combining rules, contextual dependencies, and hierarchical structure identified those same features inside whale click data. Not similar features, not analogous features, the same structural class of features that define organized language in the model's formal framework. The AI does not have a bias toward finding complexity. It does not have a preference for a particular outcome. It has no investment in what sperm whales turn out to be doing. It processed the input and reported what the input contained. And what the input contained was a communication system organized with the same formal properties that define human language at the structural level. That is a result, not an interpretation, not a hopeful extrapolation. A result. The biological question that result raises is, in some ways, more unsettling than the linguistic one, because sperm whales did not arrive at a language-like communication system by sharing evolutionary history with humans. The last common ancestor between a human and a sperm whale was a creature that looked nothing like either of them, and almost certainly communicated in ways far simpler than either. The vocal complexity of human language and the vocal complexity of sperm whale communication evolved along completely separate trajectories, separated by tens of millions of years, shaped by completely different environmental pressures, built through completely different anatomical structures. Humans produce language through a larynx, vocal folds, a resonant oral cavity, a tongue, lips. Sperm whales produce their communication through the spermaceti organ, a biological acoustic lens that focuses and projects sound with no structural equivalent anywhere in human anatomy. The mechanism is different. The evolutionary history is different. The environment is different. The sensory world the system operates in is different. And yet both systems, when analyzed by the same formal methods, show the same organizational logic. Modularity, combination, hierarchy, context sensitivity, cultural transmission, audience design. This is what biologists call convergent evolution. Two separate lineages, under separate pressures, arriving at structurally similar solutions to the same underlying problem. Flight evolved independently in birds, bats, and insects. Eyes evolved independently in vertebrates and cephalopods. Echolocation evolved independently in bats and dolphins. In each case, the convergence tells you something fundamental about the problem being solved, about the selective pressure that makes a particular solution adaptive enough to emerge twice through completely different means in completely different bodies. If complex, modular, culturally transmitted language has now evolved twice, once in humans and once in sperm whales, the question that convergent evolution always forces becomes unavoidable. What problem is language solving that makes it adaptive enough to emerge independently in two separate lineages? What is the survival function of a combinatorial grammar, a vowel-like acoustic system, an audience-designed communication structure that makes the enormous biological investment required to produce and maintain it worthwhile across evolutionary time? The answer that the evidence from Dominica, Alaska, and the Galapagos Islands collectively points toward is not simple. But it is consistent. Language, in the functional sense revealed by the AI analysis, is what allows large-brained, long-lived, socially complex, cognitively rich creatures to share not just location and identity, but knowledge. Specific, technical, accumulated, generationally transmitted knowledge. The kind of knowledge that cannot be instinctive because it is too contextual, too variable, too dependent on recent experience and local conditions to be hardwired into genetics. The orca boat targeting behavior that spread through a social group over 4 years was operational knowledge. Specific information about a specific class of object, how to interact with it, where to strike, how to coordinate group action against it. That knowledge was transmitted through communication. The sperm whale families off Dominica, who returned year after year with intact social structures and consistent coda repertoires, were transmitting generational knowledge about feeding grounds, about social hierarchies, about how to behave in the presence of specific individuals, about the acoustic identity of family members versus strangers. And when one of the world's most powerful AI analysis systems was turned on the recordings of that transmission, it found, waiting inside decades of archived clicks, a structured system capable of carrying all of that and more. The translation is incomplete. That remains true. The research team is careful, appropriately careful, to distinguish between what has been confirmed and what remains theoretical. 156 codas have been cataloged. Their internal structure has been formally described. The combinatorial rules have been partially mapped. The audience design patterns have been documented, and one coherent unit of meaning has been provisionally translated. I am here. 2 words. 3 syllables in English. In sperm whale terms, a specific click sequence, 113, that appears consistently in social contexts that map to presence, to connection, to the announcement of self within a relationship. The researchers who first saw that translation output described the room going still, not the excited noise of a confirmed hypothesis. Stillness, The kind of stillness that comes when something lands that is larger than the professional framework prepared anyone to receive. A MIT researcher, reviewing the output, said quietly, "This isn't supposed to be possible." It is worth asking, precisely and carefully, what was not supposed to be possible. The existence of a complex communication system in sperm whales, the AI's ability to decode it, or the first translated message being something so recognizably, so uncomplicatedly, so universally human in its function. Because I am here is not a territorial marker. It is not a threat display or a feeding coordination signal. It is a relational statement. It is the kind of communication that presupposes a listener who cares whether you are there. It presupposes a relationship in which your presence matters, in which your absence would be noticed, in which the announcement of your continued existence carries meaning that goes beyond information. That is not the communication of a simple creature. That is the communication of a social being embedded in a network of relationships that extend across decades of shared life, shared ocean, shared history. And somewhere in that same archive of 9,000 recordings, in the click sequences that the AI has cataloged and partially mapped but not yet fully translated, are the other things that have been said across those decades. The things said when a calf was born, when a member of the family died, and the group slowed and clustered and produced those vocalizations that no standard coda chart had ever accounted for, when danger approached and the group coordinated a response, when two whales who had not been in proximity for months came together again and exchanged the sequences that, in any social species capable of language, would mean recognition. Memory. Welcome. The translation work continues. Project CETI is ongoing, supported by researchers from more than 15 institutions, still deploying tags in Dominica, still building the behavioral context database that gives the AI the resolution it needs to decode meaning rather than just identify structure. The first full sentences, if that framework holds, remain ahead. The researchers know what they have found, and they know how much further there is to go. What has already been found, though, is not a stepping stone. It is a threshold. On one side of it, the ocean contained an impressive non-human signaling system. On the other side, it contains a language, ancient, complex, culturally transmitted, grammatically structured, emotionally loaded, and now partially, provisionally, but genuinely readable. The AI did not give whales a language. It found one that was already there. 60 million years old, carried in the largest brain of any creature on the planet, moving through dark water at 230 decibels, waiting for a moment when the tools existed to hear it clearly. That moment arrived, and the first thing it said was, "I am here." Whatever comes next in the translation, that is the line this entire discovery pivots on. Not the technology, not the methodology, not the academic framework. The fact that a creature separated from humanity by the full depth of evolutionary time, living in an environment humans cannot survive without equipment, producing sound through anatomy that has no human parallel, said, as clearly as the AI could render it, the most fundamental thing one conscious being says to another, "I am here." Which means, on the other side of that message, across 60 million years in the full depth of the Pacific, something was listening for the answer.